Over the years, I've done several shows on brothers who played pro baseball, and since this is a family show with emphasis on family, it's nice to have my brother Ed here with me today at the Souvenir Programs here, headquarters high in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Ed returns as executive producer and head writer for this episode of Held by Legends, Signed by Heroes, after a 2-year self-imposed hiatus from the channel, because of my lack of self-control when it comes to me adding my 2 cents to a story that he took the time to write. So he's here today to make sure I don't screw it up. Good luck with that, Ed. Since the beginning of baseball, there's been players that were practical jokers and like to clown around because that's what guys do. From the playground days at grade school until they're old men playing golf, razzing each other over a missed putt or a slice into the trees. Then there's the players who weren't so much pranksters and jokers, but known as goofballs, flakes, or numbskulls. For over 150 years, there's been some real characters. One was Max Patkin, who pitched a little Class D ball in the 1940s, but would go on to perform on the Major League diamond for over 50 years, even though he was never really on a team. He is known as the Clown Prince of Baseball, and you'd recognize Max by his rubbery face, smashed-in nose, and skinny bones. He made over 4,000 appearances and traveled to hundreds of ballparks around the country, making most everybody laugh. Wouldn't be long before another baseball clown came along, but this one could pitch, and did for parts of 3 decades, and during the 1950s pulled down double duty as a minor league pitcher and a crowd entertainer. He was only paid to pitch. He did the entertaining part for free. His name is Chester Lillis Johnson, nicknamed Chesty Chet. Was it because of his build or because of his gregarious nature? It was both. Standing 6 foot even, weighing 175 pounds, a lefty pitcher who made his MLB debut in 1946, born in 1917 in Redmond, Washington to George and Lillian. When George arrived in the U.S. from Norway, he changed the family name from Johansson to Johnson. The couple had 3 sons, George Jr., Chet, and 2 years later, Earl, good American names. After Earl was born, the family moved a few miles down the road to Seattle, where all 3 boys went to Ballard High School, with Chet graduating in 1937, staying local, attending the University of Washington for the next 3 years. Earl, also a southpaw, pitched 2 seasons at a school that comes up a lot on this channel, St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. You can't compare the brothers' careers. Little brother Earl played 8 seasons in the majors, pitched in the World Series for the Boston Red Sox, and fought in World War II for years before coming home a heavily decorated war hero. Big brother Chet's MLB career consisted of 18 innings with the St. Louis Browns and helped out with the war from home in Seattle. The contrast is stark. It didn't help that Chet wasn't as good as Earl, who said, "It seemed like Chet's baseball career was always being overshadowed by other guys. In high school, it was Fred Hutchinson and then myself. Seemed like folks always identified him as my brother. I think it bothered him after a point." Yet, Yankees West Coast scout Red Kellefer signed Chet right out of college to his local team, the Seattle Rainiers, and was put in Class D with the El Paso Texans. This was the beginning of a long career that lasted from 1939 to 1956, with Chet making nearly 600 pitching appearances for 24 teams during his 18 seasons of pro ball, pitching over 3,000 innings, starting 220 games, completing 136 of them, with a minor league pitching record pretty much split right down the middle, 181 wins, 185 losses. During his 2+ weeks as a major leaguer with the St. Louis Browns, Chet appeared in 5 games and had 3 starts. He gave up 20 hits, walked 13 batters, and credited with 10 earned runs. On the bright side, Chet Johnson could always say as a big league pitcher he didn't give up a home run to any of the Yankee batters. The joke there is Chet wasn't put in the game when the Browns played the Yankees. He pitched for years with no mention of a sore arm, a real workhorse, while others called him a real jackass. And he could have come back for a 19th season, but retired rather than sign a contract that stipulated he couldn't clown around on the diamond, because clown around he did, but not at first. 1940 was Chet's 2nd season and still in El Paso before being promoted to Class B Tacoma Tigers not far from home, where he got beat up in front of friends and family in his only 2 appearances, and would start 1941 down in Class C with the Bakersfield Badgers. pitching good enough to finish the season in AAA with the San Francisco Seals in the Pacific Coast League on a team with Hall of Famer Tony Lazzeri. Chet got into one game for one inning. He gave up 6 hits, 4 runs, and a walk in that one inning, then sent back down to Tacoma for 1942 to work on his pitching. He did, and the next 2 seasons were spent back in the Pacific Coast League, where he appeared in 64 games with the San Diego Padres, winning half his starts. After the 1944 season was over, and with World War II still going on, the 27-year-old went home to Seattle to do his part by working in a defense plant. But for that to happen, the Seattle Rainiers would work out a deal with the Padres that let Chesty Chet pitch for Seattle in 1945, and he had another good season, his 3rd in a row. The St. Louis Browns bought his contract in 1946 and put the Southpaw on their AAA Toledo Mud Hens. Chet started 28 games and completed 13, then called up by the Browns at the end of the season to make his MLB debut, and it was a start at Browns Sportsman Park facing the Washington Senators. Chet sat down the first 9 batters, but the big league batters of the day caught up with the rookie second time through the order, and in his next 3 innings gave up 4 singles, a double, and walked 3. Though he would come back with a 3-up, 3-down 7th inning before being replaced for a pinch hitter. Chet's final MLB start was the last game of the season. The White Sox put up 5 runs on him, and he was pulled after the 3rd inning. Earl pointed out how Chet's major league experience made him realize that he wasn't big league material, and now he's pushing 30. But he is a really good minor league pitcher. Thing is, there's quite a few of those. So if he wants to extend his career, Chet knows he needs to become a better pitcher. He chose instead to become a funnier pitcher and started working on comedy routines that he could do during the game. The very idea that was even an option tells you 2 things. Baseball was different in the first half of the 20th century, and Chet, he was a funny guy. He knew putting on a show at the ballpark can bring in the fans. So after his shot in the majors didn't pan out, the Browns sent Chet back down to Toledo for 1947, and he had the worst year of his career. Then traded to the Pittsburgh Pirates, who put him on their Indianapolis Indians for 1948 and 1949, playing with 3 notable MLB players: Pirates outfielder Ted Beard, Brooklyn's pitcher Cal McClish, and catcher Al Lopez, a future Hall of Fame manager whose teams broke up 2 Yankee pennant streaks. It's at this time Chet Johnson would become a fixture in the Pacific Coast League and a familiar face from 1950 until he retired. During those years, he got quite a reputation for his performances on the mound, not so much as a pitcher, but an entertainer. The guy liked to clown around. And over the years, Chet pioneered, planned, and practiced his pranks, going over his gags and gimmicks until great, repeatedly rehearsing his rascally routines, all the while stylizing his own shticks and stunts. But it all started with his appearance. This is what L.A. Examiner's Bob Hunter wrote in his column. For one thing, Chet's uniform never fit. It just hung on him. So that in itself was funny. Then he would wear these ridiculous outfits. One time it was a coonskin cap like Davy Crockett. Another time it was a thick set of eyeglasses, which he would take off and then offer to them umpire. Once at a Hollywood Stars game, he took the mound wearing a fake mustache like Groucho Marx. He might bring an umbrella up to home plate instead of a bat on a rainy day, or on a foggy day, go up there wearing one of those coal miner helmets with a light on top. That's what Bob wrote. Speaking of brothers, the Marx brothers were big fans of Chet, and anytime his team visited L.A., Groucho would always show up to the games with friends. Chesty Chet had real star power, attracting Hollywood's biggest funny men like Jack Benny, George Burns, and Bing Crosby, who made it a point to come see the Chet Johnson Show. A young publicity man for the Hollywood Stars named Irv Kaza, who had a legendary career as a front office executive, said, if he found out Chet had an upcoming start and he had time to promote it, Chet was good for at least 2,000 extra fans in the stands. This is what Earl said about Chet playing on the West Coast. The Pacific Coast League was a good place for him. Not only was it home, but it was a more relaxed atmosphere. A lot of the players would just as soon play out here on the coast than with a fringe major league team like the Browns. So after being away from the Seals for a decade, 1950 saw Chet back in San Francisco, and he had his best season, going 22-13, leading the P.C.L. with 22 complete games and pitched a league-high 310 innings. 1951 was the opposite. going 5-15 with the Seals, finishing the season across the bay with Oakland Oaks, playing with Alan Two-Gun Gettle and Johnny Two-No-Hit Vandermeer. You might say Chet's down season was due to a sore arm or being on the wrong side of 30, except for the fact that 4 out of the next 5 seasons he averaged close to 30 starts and pitched around 200 innings each season as a Sacramento Solon before retiring at the age of 38. But not before making a name for himself as an entertaining pitcher with a comedic flair. As early as 1950, Chet Johnson was already getting into the swing of things comedy-wise, but it wasn't until he was with the Solons that he had a nice portfolio of routines built up. Bob Stevens was a baseball writer for the San Francisco Chronicle who covered the P.C.L. for over 20 years, starting in 1936, and he saw the evolution of Chet from a 23-year-old with the Seals in 1941 trying to make the majors, right up until Chet's last season, when the pressure of those days were behind him and could spend the 1950s having fun at games. This is what Bob wrote in his column when describing Chet's routine as he stepped into the batter's box later in his career with the Solons. Chet smooths the spike-disturbed loam around home plate. Then, with hands clutching the bat at opposite ends, he dramatically raises it above his head and flexes his muscles, all the while leering menacingly out to the pitcher, who must combat this ferocious-looking individual. Johnson swings the bat furiously back and forth over the plate, hunchbacked, ready, vigilant, defiant. Ordinarily, he's out of there after a maximum of 3 pitches, all of which he swings at mightily with great crashes of air, but no sound of lumber against baseball. Before we get to Chet's magical moments monkeying around on the mound, I'll tell you about some jokers who came before and after Chet. The first so-called flake in MLB history was Hall of Fame pitcher Rube Waddell in the late 1800s, a major alcoholic who died at 37, and nowadays would probably be diagnosed with autism. Back then, he was just called retarded. Could be he was somewhere on both spectrums and a mildly autistic borderline retard like me. What's that, Ed? Or so it's been whispered. Oh, really? As a kid, Rube Waddell worked on his pitching skills by killing birds with rocks. And ever since childhood was fascinated with fire engines, and more than once during a game ran off the field to chase one down the street. Another time he left in the middle of a game to go fishing. Rube was easily distracted, and some fans knew this and would bring puppies to the game, knowing Rube would want to come over and play with them. And he would. He didn't know how many times he was married and forgot if he divorced a previous wife before getting married again. Those are not the actions of a merry prankster, but a total flake. And there is a difference. A joker is in control of his actions. A flake doesn't care. Another Hall of Famer, Rabbit Marinville, came along in the early 1900s and pretended to murder an umpire during a game using a gun and actually fired off a shot. Another player from the early 1900s was Senators infielder Carl Sawyer, who danced with a dummy during the 7th inning stretch and was known for his acrobatic physical comedy, and supposedly the only MLB player to somersault over a player to avoid the tag. And even though Max Patkin is known as the Clown Prince of Baseball, it was Senators pitcher Al Schacht in the 1920s and 30s who held the title first, teaming up with his coach Nick Altrock for over a decade of routines. Then came along Broadway Bill Schuster, who played with the Seattle Rainiers in the 1940s. At one game in Los Angeles, he hit a home run, and after crossing home plate, ran over to a pretty blonde sitting in the front row and planted a kiss on her. Another time, Broadway Bill hit an easy grounder to the first baseman, and instead of running to first base, Bill veered off course and slid into the pitcher's mound. One person who knew a lot about entertaining gimmicks, and I've mentioned him in many of my shows, was a 32-year-old World War II veteran who went through 37 operations trying to save his leg that was crushed from the recoil of an anti-aircraft cannon. His name is Sport Shirt Bill Veeck, and in 1946 bought the Cleveland Indians. And it was towards the end of the season, Sport Shirt Bill signed a goofball shortstop named Jackie Price. But after only 7 games, Jackie would retire when Sport Shirt Bill offered him a different spot on the team and a position he was better suited for, and that would be as a pregame entertainer. It's at this time Sport Shirt Bill also hired the Clown Prince of Baseball Max Patkin to join Jackie, with the two now former ball players still wearing the uniform, still on their diamond, but now being paid not to play during the game. But to entertain the fans before it started, Jackie Price would shoot umpires with water pistols and sometimes took batting practice hanging upside down, suspended from the batting cage. He could throw two balls with one hand, a fastball and a curve, both strikes. Also known for being able to throw three balls at once to three different catchers, all in the strike zone. Jackie would play catch or take pitches at the plate with boa constrictors wrapped around his body. But some jokers can take a joke too far and feelings get hurt. Sometimes bodies get hurt. A foot gets burned or somebody loses their job. But who determines when a joke has gone too far? In Jackie's case, it was Cleveland Indians manager Lou Boudreau who made that call, and he decided what was too far and too much. Because one time while the Indians were traveling on a train with a team of lady bowlers, Jackie let loose two of his snakes just to see the women's reaction and was promptly fired for that stunt. Move forward to the late 1960s, and if you had a birthday party, you knew not to invite screwball all-star Sparky Lyle, who would leave his mark at the party by sitting on the birthday cake, leaving an imprint of his naked butt. Another Jackie who was a bit of a flake was Jackie Brandt, who was given the nickname Flaky by teammate Wally Moon, who described him in one sentence. Jackie is so wild his brains sometimes fall out of his head in flakes. For instance, Jackie Brandt once played 27 holes of golf in 101-degree temperatures on the morning of a scheduled day-night doubleheader. Then there's the players of the 1970s who had to tone it down with the arrival of free agency in 1972. A new era of baseball was introduced when MLB went corporate. More business, less antics, but it didn't stop some goofballs from having fun. Frank McGraw, who you know as Tug McGraw, pitched an inning of spring training on St. Patrick's Day wearing only bright green long johns, and he grew prize-winning tomatoes in the Shea Stadium bullpen. Tug once drove himself to jail demanding to be locked up after blowing both ends of a doubleheader. Pitcher Dick Tidrow, nicknamed Dirt, specialized in sophisticated water pranks and sometimes used the bullpen phone to order Chinese takeout. On the sillier side, Gold Glover Doug Rader, a.k.a. the Red Rooster, would come down to the hotel coffee shop to join the team for breakfast with a face full of shaving cream. 1980 AL Rookie of the Year, Super Joe Charbonneau, a local boy from Santa Clara who once went to the bank and opened up an account in his underpants. Super Joe would show off by drinking a beer through his nose, and when that nose was broken, Joe repaired it himself with a pair of pliers and a few shots of Jack Daniels, and was also known for doing his own dental work. Around this time was Oakland A's Steve McCatty, master of the hot foot, and called the lead joker on a team full of jokers. Pitcher Ross Grimley was a superstitious oddball who didn't shower in the middle of his win streaks and wore turquoise contact lenses that you can see on his baseball card. And many baseball fans know the quirks of Tigers' legendary pitcher Mark Fidrich, a.k.a. the Bird. In one game, Yankees' Greg Nettles was at the plate with a bird on the mound and, as usual, talking to the ball and was just about to throw it when all of a sudden Nettles jumped out of the batter's box and called time. Nettles looked at his bat and then he started talking to it, probably trying to get in Fidrich's head. Nettles then stepped back into the batter's box and he struck out. When he came back to the dugout, he was heard saying, "Damn Japanese bat, doesn't understand a word of English." There's been thousands of players over the decades, so I'm sure I left out many a character. But enough of them jovial jokers, quirky kooks, and over-the-top oddballs, and now, as I like to say, back to the man of the moment, Chet Johnson. Before Mark Fidrich was even born, Chet was having one-way conversations with the ball and would jabber to himself on the mound, sometimes bowing to the pitching rubber. One of his more famous routines was to make a big show out of his warm-up pitches. Each pitch he threw to his catcher would be slower than the preceding one, with his catcher firing the ball back to Chet harder and harder. The payoff to the gag was after Chet threw his slowest pitch and received his hardest return throw that hit his glove with a loud smack. He'd then yelp in pain, take off his glove to reveal an oversized fake thumb wrapped in a bloody bandage. Chesty Chet developed his own double and triple windups that drove the batters, umpires, and managers crazy. But the fans loved it. He threw hesitation and blooper pitches and sometimes fired the ball to the plate underhanded. His Sacramento teammate, pitcher Bud Watkins, said, Oh my God, he would go through the strangest stuff out there on the mound. He'd pretend not to see the catcher's sign, so he'd creep in closer and closer, then squint and shake his head, until finally he was right in front of home plate, which is pretty funny in and of itself. Then he would get down on all fours and stare at the catcher's mitt for a couple of seconds, then stand up and shout, "Eureka, I got it!" and run back to the mound. He would then take his position on the rubber and very seriously and deliberately shake off the sign he was given. If you weren't laughing by then, you weren't human, said Bud. And like any good comedian, Chet used props. He carried a red handkerchief in his pocket and sometimes used it like a bullfighter does, waving it teasingly as he stood on the mound looking at the batter. If a batter hit a home run, Chet followed him around the bases, fanning him with the handkerchief. Another Chet classic was his notebook gag. He kept a small black notebook in his pocket which supposedly contained detailed information about the batters he would face. As a batter stepped up to the plate, Chet would take out his notebook and pretend to study it. If the batter got a hit, Chet made a big ordeal when crossing out the bad info in his book. If the batter hit a home run, Chet would dramatically tear out the page, rip it up, and throw the pieces in the air. Earl said he used to buy those things by the box and would go through them pretty quick, but he never really had anything written down in them. It was just another thing to do to keep the hitters thinking. Earl has a story from 1951 when the two brothers faced each other while playing in the Pacific Coast League. Earl was on the Seattle Rainiers, who were managed by Rogers Hornsby. Earl hated Hornsby, like most pitchers who played under him. Big brother Chet was pitching for the Seals, who were in Seattle for a series, Earl said. Because Chet knew what I thought of Hornsby, he really put on a show. He did all the offbeat stuff, like double and triple pumping of his arms on the windup, talking to the baseball, bowing to the umpire after a close call went his way, running off the mound after a strikeout, getting down on his hands and knees to dust off the pitching rubber. Just Chet being Chet. As this was going on, Hornsby is getting hotter and hotter. He was muttering about what a disgrace to baseball Chet was, said Earl. But it seems nobody stopped Chet. Never heard of him getting in a fight, fined, or fired for having fun. I found many quotes from interviews Earl did, but only a couple from Chet, like this one. I love to see the fans have a good time. My purpose was to make the hitters laugh with me or get so mad that they lose their concentration and swing at anything I threw. Dad has 5 of Chet's autographs, all from 1955 and 56 as a member of the Solons. One is on a Seals scorebook, right next to another showman who could really showboat, Emmett Ashford, the first black umpire in the majors. Like most ball players back then, Chet had to make that difficult transition from being a pro ball player who'd been playing around outside all day, every day for most of his life, to being under a roof, indoors, away from sunshine and the smell of fresh-cut grass, and now part of the 9-to-5 workforce. First for Seattle Fuel and later a salesman for Seattle-based Bar S Meats. At one point in his career, Chet married Nancy Lee and together raised 4 kids. 2 became ball players. Mr. Johnson stayed heavily involved in youth sports, and over the years, he refereed both college basketball and football games, with both brothers taking a couple of weeks out of their summers to serve as pitching instructors at a summer baseball camp in British Columbia. Once again, I tell you about former ball players who volunteered their time and energy so they can pass on their knowledge of sports and a few life lessons to the youth of the day. Sadly, those lessons would stop way too soon when Chet was diagnosed with cancer, passing away in 1983 at the age of 65 in the area where he grew up, Seattle, as did Earl, who followed in 1994. But the lessons taught and the stories passed on by the Johnson brothers will continue to be told by fellow players and the fans who are still around to talk about it, like my dad, who actually saw Chet perform some 70 years ago. But eventually their stories will have to be retold by their friends and family and people like me and you so they continue to be heard. I'll wrap up this show with quotes from a couple of brothers who aren't the most famous brothers in MLB history, yet both would leave their mark on the game in different ways. Earl in the majors, Chet in the minors. Earl played in the MLB World Series. Chet played a series of jokes in the P.C.L. One brother was a consummate pro ball player, the other a consummate joker who played pro ball. Earl mentioned that if you went to Chet's house, one of the few things he kept on the wall was a framed letter that Groucho Marx mailed to Chet. In that letter, Groucho complimented the longtime pitcher on his comedy routines. Earl said, "That's like Babe Ruth complimenting you on your hitting." After his playing days were over for the rest of his life, Chet Johnson had the same reply whenever someone asked if he played in the majors. With a straight face and a deadpan delivery, he would say, "No, but I did pitch for the St. Louis Browns." Now, that's a pretty funny comeback if you know about old time baseball and the many colorful characters from the first half of the 20th century, like Chet Johnson, who helped make baseball America's favorite pastime by making ball games fun for all those up in the stands who paid to get into the ballpark, and for those down on the field who got in to see the Chet Johnson show for free.